The diner was silent except for the faint rattle of a spoon against porcelain. A young waitress stood frozen behind the counter, her hand trembling as she set down a bowl of sugar. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes locked onto the man across from her. The man wasn't just any customer. He wore the uniform of a soldier, muscular, hard-eyed, the kind of man whose presence carried weight before he even spoke. But his voice cut sharp, filled with suspicion. "Funny thing," he said, leaning forward until his shadow fell across her hands. "This little town doesn't exactly seem like the place someone like you would hide out. And yet, here you are." The waitress didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her silence was an armor stronger than any weapon, but her stillness made the tension unbearable. Every patron in the diner could feel it like the moment before a storm breaks. In that charged silence, something became clear. This young woman, hidden behind an apron and coffee pots, carried a secret dangerous enough to draw the attention of men like him. And in just moments, the entire town would know why. Her name, at least the one stitched onto her uniform, was Clara. To the locals, she was just the quiet waitress at Pete's diner, the one who worked double shifts and never complained. She knew everyone's order by heart, remembered who liked extra lemon in their iced tea, and who preferred their eggs scrambled hard. But beneath the routine of cracked plates and coffee refills was a weight she carried alone. She had perfected the art of blending in, of shrinking her story into silence. Yet silence does not erase scars. At night, when the neon lights of the diner flickered against the window glass, Clara would sit alone in her tiny rented room, tracing the ridged scar along her shoulder. A bullet wound. She told anyone who asked it was from a car accident. No one pressed further because Clara had the kind of eyes that made people stop asking questions. Eyes that had seen things most people never would. She had once been someone else entirely. Not Clara, the small-town waitress, but Lieutenant Clara Hayes, Navy intelligence specialist, embedded deep in operations she was never supposed to talk about. She had walked battlefields where silence meant survival, where every wrong step could cost lives. But somewhere along the way, something happened. A mission gone wrong. Names erased from records. And Clara, too, disappeared, choosing exile in a nameless town over the haunting questions that followed her. The day the soldiers walked into the diner, it was a sweltering afternoon. The smell of fried bacon clung to the air, mixing with the sweet tang of cherry pie cooling on the counter. Locals sat in their usual booths, farmers, mechanics, truckers, all of them comfortable in the monotony of routine. Then the door swung open. 3 men entered, their boots hitting the tiled floor in heavy rhythm. They weren't from around here. Anyone could tell by the way they carried themselves, straight-backed, sharp-eyed, scanning every detail as if calculating exits. The leader carried himself with an intensity that turned heads. The American flag patch on his shoulder gleamed against his olive uniform. He had the build of a man forged by discipline and conflict, but his eyes burned with suspicion. Clara knew the type. She had once stood among them. When his gaze found hers across the diner, time slowed. He studied her face as though searching for a ghost in her features. And then, without ceremony, he walked to the counter, set his rifle against the chrome, and said, "We need answers, and we think you have them." Whispers rippled through the diner. Forks clinked against plates. The farmers shifted uncomfortably, pretending to eat but listening with sharp ears. Clara's hand tightened around the coffee pot. Every instinct told her to run, but running would only prove them right. Instead, she set the pot down, met the soldier's piercing gaze, and said nothing. Her silence was deliberate. Silence was power. The soldier leaned closer. "You know, people don't just vanish into small towns unless they've got something to hide." His tone wasn't cruel, but it carried the kind of weight that threatened to expose her with each word. Still, Clara remained silent. And yet, silence has a way of speaking louder than words. Her refusal to engage unsettled the room. Patrons looked away. unwilling to be caught in the crossfire of whatever history these strangers carried. But behind Clara's calm exterior, her pulse raced. She knew this moment would come. She had prepared for it every day since she arrived. The question was not if she would be found, but when. Years earlier, Clara had served in silence, buried in intelligence files and encrypted messages that decided the fate of soldiers on the ground. She had intercepted threats before they reached her brothers in arms. She had carried the burden of lives saved and lost. But it was one mission in particular that had defined her exile. A mission deep in hostile territory, where a name slipped through the wrong channel. The fallout was devastating. Men were lost. And though Clara had tried to carry the blame herself, she had also carried something else: evidence. Evidence that pointed not to her failure, but to betrayal inside the chain of command. That betrayal had made her a target, and the safest place she could hide was not in another city or base, but in the quiet anonymity of a diner where no one asked questions. Until now. The soldier at the counter didn't back down. He pressed further, his voice low, sharp. "You're not who you say you are, and you know exactly why we're here." Clara's hands were steady as she reached for a small bowl of sugar, sliding it across the counter. "Coffee?" she asked simply. It was not defiance, it was control. Her silence infuriated him more than any denial. But before he could respond, one of his men shifted, pulling a folded paper from his vest. A photo, faded, grainy, but unmistakable. Clara's face, younger, in uniform. Gasps rippled across the diner. The quiet waitress, the woman who had served them pancakes and pie, was suddenly unmasked as something far more. And then came the accusation. "You abandoned your team," the soldier growled. "Good men died because of you." The words cut like glass. They weren't true, but in the absence of her voice, they hung heavy in the air. The patrons looked at her with uncertainty, torn between the woman they thought they knew and the soldier these men accused her of being. As the tension threatened to break, the bell above the diner door jingled. Another figure stepped inside. An older man, weathered by time, with a limp that told its own story. He wore no uniform now, just plain clothes. But the insignia tattooed on his arm spoke of a life lived in service. He walked slowly to the counter, his cane tapping against the floor, and stood beside Clara. "This woman," he said firmly, "is no traitor." The diner went still. He looked the SEALs dead in the eye. "I was there. I saw what happened. She didn't abandon her team. She saved the few of us who made it out." The leader faltered, his jaw tightening. The room's moral tide shifted in an instant. And Clara, still silent, still unflinching, let the truth unfold without her saying a word. The soldier's authority began to crumble under the weight of truth. He realized he had misjudged not just her, but the silence she carried. Because silence, in Clara's case, was not guilt. It was discipline. It was honor. It was survival. The older veteran's voice shook with emotion. "Some battles don't end on the battlefield. Some follow you home. And this woman has carried one alone for far too long." One by one, the townspeople rose from their booths. Farmers, truckers, mechanics, ordinary people who had known Clara not as a fugitive, but as the woman who had shown kindness in the quiet moments of their lives. Their silent solidarity filled the diner with a force more powerful than weapons. And then came the moment that sealed it. The leader of the SEALs looked at her one last time. She met his stare without a word. And finally, he whispered, almost to himself, "Silence isn't weakness. It's the loudest kind of strength." The SEALs left as quietly as they had come, their heavy boots fading down the road. No one in the diner spoke until long after they were gone. Clara returned to her work, pouring coffee as though nothing had happened. But the eyes that followed her now were filled not with suspicion, but with respect. For years, she had hidden her past, convinced that silence was her punishment. But in that diner, she discovered silence could also be her redemption. Heroes don't always wear uniforms forever. Sometimes, they trade them for aprons, fading into small towns where no one knows their name. And yet, their silence speaks of sacrifices the world will never fully see. In Clara's case, the truth wasn't shouted. It wasn't argued. It was revealed in dignity, in the quiet strength of someone who refused to defend herself because she knew honor needs no defense. And maybe that's the lesson. Respect is not owed because of what people say about themselves, but because of what they carry in silence. Wherever you're watching from tonight, remember sometimes the strongest battles are fought in silence. And the greatest heroes are the ones sitting quietly beside us, unnoticed, until the day their strength is revealed. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories that honor true silent heroes.